Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and we are in the week 2 of discussing Mughal paintings and Mughal textiles. So as we have sort of prepared the stage for discussing that, what kind of interrelations we are talking about the Mughal textiles as well as the miniature paintings. So here what we'll see that we'll try to understand that what was going on for making the Mughal miniature paintings that gives its very distinctive sort of character. So during Humayun's during the second Mughal emperor, son of Emperor Babur, Humayun's time period, we find that when Humayun was in part of Kabul, Kandahar, and then also in Middle East when he was there. So during this time we find that he had come in contact with a number of calligraphers and miniature painters and artists. So for example, we'll find that Abd al-Samad Shirazi, so from Shiraz, and then also another artist will find that that is Akhariza al-Harawi from, of course, both of them are from Iran, and we'll see them that how during when Humayun came back to India and then defeated Sher Shah and then sort of reinstated the Mughal rule in the northern Indian plains. So during this time we find that how these two prolific artists, Abd al-Samad Shirazi and Akhariza al-Harawi, were invited to the Mughal court, and then they were not just there responsible for doing this miniature paintings, but then they were also became responsible for teaching and supervising the entire atelier. We'll find them that how there were many other miniature artists who will be trained under their supervision, and then of course we will find that how there are many other miniature painters who will be there. Either they were invited by the royals or they would arrive there in search of job or livelihood, and then people from part of Middle East, from various parts of northern India and so on, all of them would gather in this miniature making workshops. So this is one of these images by Abd al-Samad Shirazi, and this is actually one of the later drawings of Shirazi, and in which we find that how this one was perhaps it was much more sort of different and refined from some of his early works that we find, and then some of the early works that had this distinctive the Persian character that we have there, and in the later works we find that perhaps with the interaction with the indigenous miniature artist, we find that the figuration and then the use of line and shading and gradation and everything else, they have become much more different, which are more close to the kind of the language of Mughal miniatures that we can sort of associate with. So in this case what happens that when we see this particular painting, there is also a meeting of two different kinds, and it's something, if we are thinking in terms of this idea of cosmopolitanism, that how in one of those workshops or this Mughal karkhanas in perhaps in Delhi or in Agra or in Fatehpur Sikri, we have that people from various different places. So it's not just that kind of cosmopolitanism we are talking about, and it's not just that kind of meeting we are talking about, but then people like Akbar, we find that in this image we see this young Akbar is seated on beneath a tree, this chinar tree that we find. It's a very characteristic tree that we find in Kashmir and part of Himalayas, and then in the underneath this tree we see that Akbar is seated there, and then he is rested on a huge bolster, and then there is also a fabric which is there underneath him. So he is seen here as this royal figure, and then there is a dervish who we find to be here prominently sort of asking either alms or some kind of engaging in some kind of a conversation with Emperor Akbar. So in this case what we find that this is a way of showing that how the royalty and the divinity, or how the royalty and dervishes, or the people who are on the spiritual path, they kind of meet. And this is also a theme that we find that to be much sort of emphasized in the Persian miniatures, as well as in some of the miniature paintings in the Mughal context, in which we find that Akbar was certainly someone who was self-fashioning himself as this religious authority during his rule. He was not just trying to sort of claim himself as this supreme political authority of the Mughal the dynasty, but he was also sort of proclaiming himself as this religious authority by sort of establishing this new way of living, that is Din-e-Ilahi. And so in these cases we find that in this painting as well, if we are thinking in terms of like meeting of different elements, here we find that there is meeting of like different kind of lifestyles, there is meeting of like different people from different sort of like walks of life, and also like from the different sectors of the society, and then also that what does that mean, like bringing like the materiality and spirituality together, and something we find that it was also ingrained in the culture of the Mughal emperors such as Akbar and Jahangir very much. So with those aspects in mind, we can think that when we say that the cultural cosmopolitanism or like coexistence of different ideas, it's not just there that one idea is borrowed from one place, another idea is sort of like imbibed from some other resources, and then they are clubbed together. But we are also talking in terms of like some of those metaphors, some of those metaphysical sort of experiences, and how those can be like brought together in the visual representations. So from looking at all of those visual representations, what we see that and then considering all those peculiarities, then let us come back to the Mughal textiles, and then we see that what is there as significant in terms of like this Mughal textiles, so or the textiles which were produced during the Mughal era. Now this is a fragment of a carpet that shows niche and then like the flower designs, and it came from again like the early half of 17th century, 1630 to 1640, and in this one we have like this carpet. So carpet is something that we find that to be prominently made, and then also that is something that we find that to be very much in use in the during the Mughal period, and it was also something that came from like with the Central Asian customs. Of course there were use of carpets beforehand as well, but then like particular kind of making of these carpets was something that was excelled during this time period. And in these carpets what we find that there are the technical complexity that reached its zenith during this time period, and then there is also very much a careful choice of material that we find that to be there in these carpets, that where to use cotton, where to use silk, where to use this fine pashmina wool. So those kind of choices we find that to be there, which also like the kind of visuals we find on those carpets responsible for. So the kind of material, the technicalities, and then like of course in terms of like execution of the visuals, all of them are intertwined in this way. Now in this one what we also find that why do we sort of consider this kind of textiles to be much more finer compared to the other sorts, and in this is one of the finest of the Mughal carpets, even though it is in the form of a fragment, but one of the finest what we consider is because like the finesse of the carpets is also sort of decided by how many knots would be there in 1 square inch. And for this particular carpet that we have on screen, it almost has 2250 knots within 1 square inch, and that's something that makes it highly complex and intricate. And for that reason, since we have this many knots within like 1 square inch, for that reason we have the precision of the design that we can see it here. We'll come back to like this precision of the design, but this is something that I wanted to just introduce first and then sort of move on to the rest of it. Now this is an image, of course this comes much later, and this is also not it is definitely not from the northern Indian plains. This is from Mysore, actually from Hosur. So this is a pile carpet loom that we find in the 1850s, and why I wanted to show this image is because just to show that what kind of organization we are talking about when we say carpet weaving. So in this case, what we see that, I mean, in the earlier modules we have sort of looked into the kind of making of the textiles which are on the horizontal plane. Even though in the draw loom we definitely see that, I mean, there is a draw person or a draw boy who would be like, I mean, lifting the threads and sort of like, I mean, allowing the weft thread to sort of get through it, and that is how, like, I mean, the complex designs are sort of produced. But then all of those were there on a horizontal loom always. Now for a carpet loom, for a tapestry loom, what we find that, I mean, there are the, I mean, it is actually on a vertical setting. So we have the entire loom structure that we have on this image, in which this huge wooden posts are there, and then of course, like, I mean, how the wooden posts are then like connected with the bars, and then in the entire loom setup we find that, I mean, it sort of makes provision for multiple people to sit and work there together. And this is also, we can imagine that when we talk about carpet or a floor spread, we are talking about something which would cover a large part of the floor. So this is not something we can imagine which would be possible to make within a loom, which is this, the width of it is limited. So we need something for that, in which, like, I mean, the width will be much more bigger than the ones we have in the draw looms or the pit looms or the backstrap looms. So in this case, what happens, we find that there is the warp thread, the weft thread, and on the top of that we have the knots which are sort of like, I mean, made on this pile carpet. So for piling, we find that usually wool is preferred in the Mughal context. So all the colors that we find, all the different kinds of like patterns and everything we find, mostly those are made in wool. And if those are like the finer qualities of those carpets, we find that those very expensive pashmina wool is then used there. And in this image we also find that, I mean, how there are all those the yarns we can find that to be there, like, I mean, sort of like hanging on the top of this bar, I mean, from this bar, and then all those yarns will be like, I mean, sort of the connecting threads will be there, and then the weavers, they would be like, I mean, using them to sort of make the knots and then cut them there and then again make a knot. So in the arrangement of those warps. So this is how we find that how this carpet weaving sort of like, I mean, continues. And in this case, what we also see that, I mean, today in the present day we have, like, I mean, some of the areas where like this kind of pile carpet weaving is continued. One of the prominent places will be Vadohi in Uttar Pradesh, which is not that far from Agra. And then in there we also have, like, I mean, many of the carpet weavers who would be like, I mean, continuing this similar kind of process, completely hand woven and process of, like, I mean, making this pile carpets. Then in this context we also find that, I mean, there are other kinds of textiles. So for example, this very complex velvet textiles, and even though, like, I mean, in velvet also this piling technique is used, but then velvet is not really made in a vertical loom, but it is made in a draw loom, in complex draw loom, in which, like, I mean, there are multiple warps are used, and then velvet is a kind of a warp pile weave that it sort of, like, I mean, incorporates in that. It is technically it's very different from how, like, the carpet weaving sort of happens. So with those things, if we understand that, I mean, this carpet loom that has this vertical orientation, and whereas like draw loom, pit loom and all of them, they have the horizontal orientation. So with those we can keep them in mind, and then when we sort of, like, I mean, compare some of the other visual records with them, we can sort of, like, I mean, think through that. So this is also something we find that, I mean, during this time we have, like, I mean, the visual representations of this minutely made carpets. So for example, this is a detail from this particular painting which was represented Shah Jahan, and in this one we have, like, I mean, a number of these carpets which are there sort of adorning the floor, whereas we in the background we have this lattice work, like, I mean, this jali work on marble, and of course also in the sandstone here. So this different kind of, like, I mean, this ornamentation, and also, like, I mean, the how all those precision that is there on stone as well as on the carpet and so on, all of them, they sort of come together in this visual representation. It's a good example of that. Now for the Mughal rugs, we find that, I mean, during the one of the most significant exhibitions which displayed large number of Mughal rugs or like these fragments was in 1997 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which was called Flowers Underfoot, Indian Carpets on Mughal Era. So that particular exhibition, which also marked the 50th year of Indian independence from 1947, so that exhibition was one of the most significant exhibitions that we find that it sort of hold a large quantity of Mughal this carpets in under one roof. So we also find that, I mean, when this carpet weaving was sort of like, I mean, it was encouraged, it was not just something that was patronized by the court, but I mean some of the emperors, the Mughal emperors, they also had much interest in particularly in carpet weaving, in velvet making and things like that. So we find that, I mean, particularly that Emperor Akbar had much interest in carpet making, and his biographer Abul Fazl had also mentioned that, I mean, Akbar's inclination towards making or like, I mean, to know more about, like, I mean, carpet. And then what we find that, I mean, when there are certain, like, I mean, descriptions about the city of Fatehpur Sikri and Agra, and then how the bazaar area or, like, I mean, the different kind of workshops were sort of set up around the royal enclosure, or like, I mean, close to the royal enclosure, we find that different kinds of workshops, those are also mentioned by Abul Fazl and other biographers, that, I mean, they have mentioned that, I mean, how the different kind of workshops of tapestry making, carpet weaving, curtain making. So curtain making would also entail like different kind of rafugari and tailoring, and then also, like, I mean, goldsmiths work, and those kind of, like, I mean, things would be there side by side. All different kind of workshops, this all different kinds of artisanal workshops will be there very close to the royal enclosure. Now very interestingly, we also find that, I mean, the making or manufacturing of arms, like, I mean, the arms, guns, and, like, I mean, swords and things like that, which would be predominantly made with metals, would also be there side by side with this kind of workshops. So we do not really find that, I mean, there is a stark differentiation between something that is used in the interior setting like carpet or this delicate textiles, and then something that is used in warfare or for security reasons like gun or like different kinds of arms. So these things were all sort of, like, I mean, continued side by side. We can also see the kind of, like, I mean, the divisions that we make today in terms of, like, I mean, what is more suited for the interior space, or, like, I mean, what is there for, like, the military use or the army use. So those kind of divisions, we do not really find that to be there that prominent in terms of, like, I mean, when we are considering this early modern workshops. Now adding to that, we also find that Awad al-Samad Shirazi was also made the director of the Royal Mint in Agra. So even though we find that, I mean, he was primarily an artist, a calligrapher, a supervisor and a teacher, we find that, I mean, how Akbar was very much impressed by his work, and then eventually he made him the director of the Royal Mint in Agra. It is something that we also find that, I mean, how the artists were given roles which are much more sort of politically important and active role. However, there is no such division that what the artist can do and what the people who are prominently there in the political positions can do. So there were much more of those fluid exchanges, or like those juxtapositions were very different from the way we understand them today. So from there, what we also see that, I mean, there are many this carpets and things like that they are mentioned in the Mughal records, and one of the things we will also find that to be there is this, how the Mughal records, the reports and so on, they would have, like, I mean, particular records on the market price of particular yarn, or, like, I mean, the goods, and that sort of, like, I mean, gives us a sense of, like, I mean, if something that is imported from somewhere else, then what kind kind of cost we are talking about, and then like what is their value, not only just the economic value but social value, cultural value, and things like that. So we see those different kind of things when we sort of consider these records. And one of the records that also mentioned this devastating fire in one of this warehouse spaces of Fatehpur Sikri in 1579, and in which a lot of these textiles were gutted in fire. And so for those, that sort of also gives us a sense about how much of this precious textiles which were not just made and sort of manufactured in and around Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, but also brought from different parts of the subcontinent, and then they were kept in this warehouse, and after this devastating fire, what kind of loss they have encountered. And that also gives us a sense about this large variation, diversity of textiles which reached the Mughal court or this Mughal warehouses. So this kind of different information that also help us to understand that if we are thinking in terms of cosmopolitanism in relation to trade, material, and so on, then the reach of the cosmopolitanism is until what. Now continuing on that discussion, we can also see that what all different kind of materials are used, and whether these materials also sort of make us think about this unique nature of cosmopolitanism in the Mughal court or not. So here I just wanted to focus on one of those aspects of the materials those are used for carpet making, and that is the dyes. So for example, we have the silk or the wool yarn which is used for the pile carpet making. So we find that mostly wool is used for making this pile carpets in the Mughal context in northern India. However, in the Deccan and so on, we also find that how silk yarn is used for making these carpets. Now this wool yarn, as I have already mentioned in the earlier module, that how wool is this protein fiber which is much more easier to dye than compared to cotton yarn. Now but then what happens is that in this carpets or any of those other the fabrics, we find that there is a tremendous diversity of color that we have. And if we are thinking in terms of 16th or 17th century, we can imagine that all those colors were obtained from natural dyes. So what kind of color we are talking about, and then if we are also thinking in terms of imported yarn or imported goods from one place to another, then what all differences we can see it there. So for example, in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, we have different kinds of madder that is used there for obtaining the shades of red. And so the one that we have in the left side of the screen, this image, this one detail from a larger carpet in which the red background that we have, there is much more kind of this earthy red, and then also sort of this blood red background that we have here. It is obtained from madder, and some of the scholars, they have also suggested that there might have been a combination of madder and lac together for sort of tinting this yarn. Now lac is something that is traditionally used for dyeing wool and silk, because the impact of lac is much more better on protein fiber than on cotton fiber. In general, that cotton or cellulose fiber is harder to dye, but then for lac, it is always it gives its best results on silk and wool. Now if it is combined with madder, then this kind of color it can yield. So this is one of the examples. And then the other example that we have on screen, on the right side of the screen, and in the red ground there, that we find that to be, it is much more sort of this pinkish red. I'm not sure if it is much clear on the slide, but this pinkish red kind of this a bit more different from the earthy red that we are talking about in the South Asian context, is something that we find that to have obtained from using cochineal. And in the Mughal context, we find that either this pinkish red, this bright pinkish red yarns were imported from Iran, or like this Iranian carpets, like this one that we have on the right side of the screen. It is a Iranian carpet from 16th century. It's a gigantic, huge carpet, and it's intact. So this carpet that we find that to have extensive use of cochineal, and cochineal is something that is not a dye stuff that is obtained from vegetal sources or from plant, but it actually comes from a particular insect. So what we see here is that these different kinds of dyes, and if we sort of pay attention to the details, we can see that this particular kind of colors, certain colors are achieved in the South Asian context, and then certain colors were preferred or achieved in Iranian context, and these two things, they also stand somewhat like side by side, and if we pay attention to them, we can also see that how the difference in color also talks about that, how they are also related to different geographical locations. And then if both this kind of textiles, the textile that we have in the right side of the screen is not something that is found from the Mughal court, but we can imagine that similar sort of textiles, if they arrive in the Mughal court, then one would be able to sort of tell that if it is Iranian textile, because of looking at this pinkish bright red and distinguishing that with the madder red that we have in the South Asian context. Now we also find that particular kinds of colors were much more sort of achievable in South Asia than in Middle East, and that is the reason the kind of the variation of the yarns that we have. If it is red, then we are not just talking about one particular bright earthy red, but then there are also sort of variations in red, that can have much lighter tone in it. It can also be combined with other dyes, for example pale yellow and so on, and this combinations, all this permutation and combination, something we find that in the South Asian context, the dyeing processes have reached much complex sort of a destination than compared to many other parts of the world. And that is the reason what we find in this South Asian these carpets, like for example the one we have on screen, the left side, it is from northern India, perhaps from Lahore. There are various gradations of the same color that we can see there, and that's the reason a soft modulation of the body of these animals that we find that to be there is present, which would probably not be the same way if we compare that to the Iranian counterpart. So these are the different kind of aspects we find, that as we have mentioned, that the Mughal cosmopolitanism, in which we have the similarities, differences, and this coexistence, the different kind of elements, they are sort of they are side by side. All of those things we will be seeing them in these artifacts, and we can compare textile with textile and textile with other artifacts, and that's how the discussion can be much more enhanced. We'll continue this discussion much more in the next lectures. Thank you.